ledger of word for word what was said. They're going to keep pressing and pressing until they finally break proper protocol in bringing this person, male or female, out in front of the American people. And to me, that is a violation of policy making, because that person may have very well not have taken on the position of doing that job if he or she felt like that the government was going to violate that agreement. I'm pretty sure that they're fixing to wrap this up to some degree. This will be part 2 of the impeachment hearing inquiry pertaining to Donald J. Trump. On this particular day.
I thank the gentleman. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony today, for your decades of service to the country. I think you exemplify so many courageous men and women who serve in the diplomatic corps, who served in our military, who represent the United States so well around the world. I appreciate how you endeavored to stay out of the fray, to relate what you heard, what you saw, without additional commentary. That is as it should be. You were both compelled to appear, and we are grateful that you answered the lawful subpoenas that you received. The story that you have shared with us today and your experiences, I think, is a very deeply troubling one. It is the story of a dedicated ambassador, someone who served with great distinction, Ambassador Yovanovitch, who was the subject of a vicious smear campaign at the beginning of the year. It is the story of once this ambassador was pushed out of the way, the creation of a irregular channel, which Ambassador Taylor, you described, went all the way from the president through Mick Mulvaney, through Ambassador Sondland, through Ambassador Volker, to Rudy Giuliani. That over time became apparent was not serving the U.S. interest, but running deeply contrary to the U.S. interest, was in fact conditioning a White House meeting that the President of Ukraine desperately sought to establish himself as the new President of Ukraine and to demonstrate to friend and foe alike that he had a relationship with his most powerful patron, the United States of America, and conditioned $400 million of bipartisan taxpayer-funded military support for a nation at war on the front lines of Russian expansionism. A suspension of which was not in the U.S. interest, not in Ukraine's interest, not in our national security interest in no way, shape, or form. You've described a situation in which those in the service of the president made it clear to the Ukrainians they need to publicly announce these investigations or they weren't going to get that meeting, and they sure weren't going to get that military assistance. Now, I would point out, and this may not have come to your attention, but it certainly came to our attention. On September 9th, Inspector General informed our committee that the Director of National Intelligence was withholding a whistleblower complaint in violation of the statute. By that point on September 9th, that complaint had made its way to the White House. On September 9th, when the Inspector General informed Congress that that complaint had been withheld, the White House also learned that Congress now inevitably would learn about the complaint. It was less than 48 hours later that the military aid would be released. Over the weeks to come, or over the days to come, rather, we will hear from other dedicated public servants about other aspects of this effort to invite foreign interference in our election, to condition a White House meeting and military aid for the performance of political favors for the president's reelection campaign. We will hear from other witnesses. I appreciate members on both sides of the aisle who I think participated today in a serious way and in a civil way. This is as it should be. There is no shortage of strong feelings about what this means to the country. At the end of the day, we're going to have to decide, based on the evidence that you and others provide, whether we're prepared to accept in the presence of the United States a situation where the president, for their own personal or political benefit, can condition military aid, diplomatic meetings, or any other performance of an official act in order to get help in their reelection. Whether we will need to accept in this president or any future president the idea that the President of the United States can invite a foreign country to intervene in our affairs. These are the decisions we will have to make when we have to decide whether this president should be impeached. But I want to thank you again. Just conclude by saying, because I can't let it go unanswered, several of my colleagues made the statement repeatedly that I've met with the whistleblower, that I know who the whistleblower is. It was false the first time they said it. It was false the second through 40th time they said it. It will be false the last time they say it. With that, this concludes this portion of the hearing. I want to thank you, gentlemen. I ask everyone to remain in their seats. The witnesses are excused. Please allow them to leave the committee room. We will, once they leave the committee room, take a brief recess, and then we will resume to take up Mr. Conaway's motion. And once again, I thank you, gentlemen.
First witness is there. Leaving the hearing room, George Kent William Taylor, after about 5.5 hours of testimony before the House Intelligence Committee.
The committee
there
is
in the Ways and Means Committee
subject to the call
hearing
chair,
room of the House
we'll
in Washington, D.C. A tale of two witnesses, also a tale of two very different committees, if you look at Republicans and Democrats on that committee, after testimony by both diplomats laying out what they believed was a pressure campaign conditioning U.S. aid in a White House meeting on the Ukrainians pursuing investigations asked for by President Trump, investigations into Joe Biden, investigations in the 2016 campaign. Democrats suggesting they see clear evidence of an impeachable offense. Republicans saying essentially by the end of the hearing, no harm, no foul. The aid eventually went through that had been suspended and no investigations were done. I want to bring in Dan Abrams, our chief legal analyst, on that point first, because we clearly saw William Taylor laying out what he believed was a quid pro quo in that first round of questioning. Republicans, by the end of the hearing, had settled on this idea. As long as the aid went through, it proves that this is not an impeachable offense.
Right. And so that's been the heart of the Republicans' argument here is look at what the end result was. And you hear the Democrats saying, but wait a sec, what about the process in between? And of course, in the end, the aid was released after it became clear there was a whistleblower and everything was about to come out. But I think that one thing the Republicans did well
exactly
was they did not accuse the witnesses of being liars. One of the things we wondered coming into this is, are they going to say, these guys, you can't trust these guys. These guys are liars. They didn't say that. They didn't do that. Instead, what they did is they were suggesting either they're exaggerating or they're dupes.
Might have gotten it wrong.
Or they're wrong. Those are all possibilities, according to them, but they didn't attack them for being, for lying. Now, another thing that I think was very important is you did hear them say that they thought this was wrong. I mean, under questioning, they did say that when looking at the entirety of what happened here, particularly in the context of everything, that it was wrong. And finally, I think that they run a risk here by putting too much weight on Volker as a witness moving forward.
The Republicans.
The Republicans, because that's one of the witnesses that the Democrats have agreed to let them call, who's going to testify, who has said that he didn't know of a quid pro quo, But there is other evidence in Volker's testimony which is going to be damaging to the Republicans' account. For example, he says the whistleblower's account was fairly accurate. He says that the investigation into Trump was for Biden. It was about Biden, not about broad corruption.
Right.
And Volker is now saying that it's clear the investigations were for political interest. So those were a lot of the themes we heard today.
Right.
And you hear the Republicans focusing on him, at least a couple of them, as to Volker's credibility. Well, when he testifies, he's going to be at least a mixed bag.
The second point of focus, Kate Shaw, for the Republican questioning was that both William Taylor and George Kent hadn't spoken directly to the president. This is not firsthand knowledge, and that could leave them open to questioning about their witnesses as well.
Right, so I think that's another line of arguments you saw emerging, that this was like second or third or fourth hand information and thus not very credible. And I would say there are a couple of responses to that. One, when you're building a case, this isn't a case in court, it's an impeachment case, but the Democrats are building a case, and it's okay for different witnesses to fill in different parts of the picture. So they're creating essentially a broad outline of the narrative, and so I think the Democrats are hoping other witnesses will fill in the gaps. The other point I would make, and this is I think something that Schiff really drove home, a big reason that right now there aren't witnesses who can speak more directly to the president's words or the president's thinking is that the White House has blocked access to witnesses who might have more personal knowledge of these events. And so it's a little bit of heads we win and tails you lose it. They say you can't have these witnesses, and then your case is weak because you don't have these witnesses.
Barbara Comstock, you've helped prepare Republicans for the last impeachment hearings, of course, a former member of Congress as well. One thing I think Adam Schiff hit at the end, which holds for both sides, it was more serious and civil debate than perhaps we expected in this hearing.
Yeah, no, I think they did behave well. I think the members like Elise Stefanik and Will Hurd really did focus on the money going through, and that there, so that the policy wasn't damaged. And actually, one of the interesting things that both they and I believe it was Congressman Winstrup pointed out was that the Trump administration policy towards Ukraine was far better than the Obama administration. So I think the fact that they're looking beyond whatever went on in that gap in between is sort of the no harm, no foul. But I think Jim Jordan on that was more hostile to the witnesses, and I don't think that helps long term.
David Muir, World News anchor David Muir there at the Capitol. One thing that is so clear at the end of this 5.5, 6 hours, this first impeachment hearing, that partisan divide is as wide as ever.
Yeah, civil, as you said, George, but it was politically divisive and politically charged all day here. And George, you and I began this morning by talking about Ambassador Bill Taylor, the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, being the star witness. And it was clear in this afternoon portion that Republicans were zeroing in on some of Bill Taylor's most damning testimony, both behind closed doors and right here today. They pressed him on his critique of this irregular channel of diplomacy, making the point that it's out of the ordinary, but pressing him, is it really outlandish? And he paused and would not answer that question. Representative Jim Jordan pressing him on his 3 meetings with President Zelensky of Ukraine, saying, did it ever come up in those meetings? Was there a linkage of the money to these investigations? A quid pro quo? Was it apparent in those meetings? And Ambassador Taylor acknowledged that the money never actually came up in those conversations. And so he pressed him, well, then how did you have a clear idea that this nearly $400 million in military aid was being held? And he again took it back to Ambassador Sondland, saying it came directly from him, that he had said if Zelensky did not clear things up, we would be at a stalemate, and that this included the White House meeting and, of course, the military aid. And the third and major point that Republicans kept going back to, you mentioned it just a moment ago, were you on the phone call? Did you listen in on the president? And furthermore, have you ever had a meeting with President Trump or with the acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney? That is a point they'll continue to make going forward, saying that this was hearsay. These were conversations that you were part of and that you heard, but you were never connected to the direct principles in this. You saw the one Democrat who joked, well, then bring President Trump before the committee and let's ask him some questions. That obviously is not going to happen. And in the end, George, the central premise of the Democrats, the money in the end was delivered, they say, only days after the investigations began here up on the Hill and after that whistleblower's report became public.
David Muir, thanks. John Carl at the White House, where President Trump is about to hold a press conference with the president of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan. And John, one of the things we saw from the White House, the president a little more quiet over the course of the afternoon. But any other reaction?
Let's see if we can't get the president's press conference. Man, I had no idea that this was going to be this in depth and this long. I knew it was going to be intense. I just didn't know how intense. They're bringing in a commercial. That's the first commercial I've seen all day. Actually, this isn't a commercial. This is back to its original broadcasting. There's a commercial. So we need to do something different in here.
Kept asking me, but I would say, well, like I don't know anybody. But they made me get
about the level of the witnesses. Mike Pompeo wasn't there. John Bolton wasn't there. The Vice President of the United States obviously knows a lot. John Bolton ought to testify. If he's telling private audiences this week, he's been very critical of the president, that maybe he has further revelations, it's his patriotic duty to testify.
Do you think if any of those people, Mike Pompeo, Vice President Pence, do you think of John Bolton, do you think if they had anything exculpatory to say, that Donald Trump would say, screw executive privilege, executive immunity, get your rear end up there and make sure it's on TV?
There's no question about it. And so the fact that they won't let the decision makers appear, I think tells you a lot about how the White House is handling this.
Well, have you ever seen anything like this?
Never. Bill Taylor was asked that question today. Have we ever? I worked from 1980 on in the U.S. government for 5 presidents. No president in our lifetime has ever asked another leader to investigate that president's rival for political gain, for the president's reelection. It's an abuse of the president's power. I mean, the lawyers here will tell me if there's an impeachment case. I think as a civilian, there is an impeachment case. And frankly, what I saw today was thousands of diversionary tactics by the Republicans and a lot of defaming of my 2 friends, Bill Taylor and George Kent. They've got nothing on the central story, which is the president tried to extort the Ukrainian government.
Ambassador Burns, it's always a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much for spending some time with us.
I'm like him. After hearing this report today, coming directly testimony from 2 upstanding people who have absolutely got an impeccable record. I'm like him. I think what the president has done is an impeachable offense, because it wasn't until after they realized that he had gotten caught, that a red flag had been thrown up, was whenever they decided to release the aid to the Ukrainians. It's sad. It's sad that we have reached a point in our democracy to the point that we have to readjust the people that we have elected or hired to represent us in a pure, wholesome, honest, upstanding way. And when we do not have that, then we have to make adjustments. And that's what these hearings are all about. Nobody is trying to pick on nobody pertaining to being biased against any particular president. It don't matter what president it may be. It could be Timbuktu. It just so happens Donald Trump got caught doing just exactly that. We want to end this session once more. This has been a long, drawn out day. A day that I wasn't expecting to reveal itself or unveil itself the way that it has unveiled itself. We're right here in the evening hours. It'll be a day or 2 before I can ever even attempt to get all of this on my YouTube platform. But I want to say thank you to my viewers. Thank you for being appreciative of the Windmill Ministries that stands up for biblical Bible prophecy and end time events. Want to say thank you for your prayers. Thank you for your understanding. And may we continue to venture and to go where no man has gone before, just as the Star Trek slogan, going where no man has gone before. May we continue to stay strong, fair, and honest with not only ourselves, but with our allies and our future allies to come towards being one of the greatest, strongest nations up onto this planet. Shalom.